There was a meeting that never made it into the Red Book, a meeting that could have changed everything. Most fans of Middle-earth know Legolas as the deadly archer from Mirkwood, fighting alongside Aragorn and Gimli in the Fellowship of the Ring. But what if I told you there's a story hidden deep in the lore, barely mentioned but full of unanswered questions, where Legolas meets two forgotten Istari in secret? Yeah, I'm talking about the Blue Wizards, LOTR and Pallando, wizards who vanished into the east and were pretty much written off by the rest of the west. Tolkien once wrote that the Blue Wizards went into the east and do not come into the tales of the north. But in his later letters, especially letter Sut 211, he revised that. He said they did have a role, one that might have been crucial in weakening Sauron's hold on the Easterlings, and that's where this story starts. With a secret return to the west, far from the eyes of Gondor, Rohan, and even Galadriel. Picture this. The year is 3018 of the Third Age. The shadow of Mordor is growing, and the Fellowship hasn't even formed yet. Legolas is sent south on a silent errand by his father, Thranduil. Not to scout Gollum, like the Council would later assume, but to respond to a call sent by wind and whisper from far beyond Mordor. A summons wrapped in ancient Elvish, carried by a raven, signed by two names no one had spoken in centuries. The Blue Wizards hadn't vanished. They'd been watching, and now they were back. Not to interfere with the West, but to warn it. They knew something Sauron didn't, that power was building again in Rhûn, in ways that couldn't be seen from Minas Tirith's towers or Lothlorien's flats. They needed someone who could move without attracting attention, and Legolas was the perfect choice. So Legolas leaves the familiar woods of Mirkwood behind, alone, without the Fellowship, without Aragorn, without his father's protection. He travels eastward past Dale and into the wilds beyond the Sea of Rhûn, into lands few elves dared walk. And it's there, under the light of a blood moon, that he meets them. Two cloaked figures standing by a still lake, speaking in tongues that echoed the music of the Ainur. That meeting, it was never recorded in Elrond's archives. It didn't make it into Frodo's notes or Sam's tales, but it happened. And what was shared there, between a prince of the elves and two ancient Maiar, would set into motion events that even Gandalf didn't see coming. Legolas wasn't picked by chance. Thranduil's son may have been known for his bow, but there was more to him than skill and silence. What few know, and what the Blue Wizards remembered, is that Legolas came from a line deeply marked by the sea. Not in the way of the Falmari, who sailed from Alqualonda, but in a quieter, older sense. A longing whispered into his spirit by the Maya Ossa, long before Legolas ever heard the crash of waves on Gondor's shores. Tolkien hinted at this in The Return of the King, when Legolas stands by the sea and says, "I have never beheld it before, yet the sound of it is in my heart." That wasn't just poetic elf speak. That was the sea longing, a sign of those touched by Ossa, the Maiar who served Ulmo, and who loved the shores and the wild, untamed waters. It ran deep in certain elven bloodlines, and that connection made Legolas uniquely attuned to something the Blue Wizards needed. LOTR and Pallando hadn't chosen a Noldo or a wise elf lord from Rivendell. They needed someone who could feel the tremors in the world, someone intuitive with senses not dulled by power or pride. Legolas, raised in the shadows of Mirkwood, walking with nature yet still drawn to something beyond the trees. He was that bridge, part warrior, part wanderer, part seer. When the Blue Wizards revealed this to him, standing beneath stars older than Arda itself, Legolas didn't speak. He listened. For the first time, he felt that his sea longing wasn't a burden or a distraction. It was a signal. Ossier hadn't abandoned Middle-earth. His whispers still stirred in the tides of the east, and the Blue Wizards had been listening, learning from the waves where most only heard silence. They explained that the east had its own rhythms, its own signs. There were powers moving there that responded not to flame or shadow, but to water, wind, and memory. Forces older than Sauron, some corrupted, some resisting, and Legolas, with his sea-tide spirit, could sense them in ways no mortal ever could. That's why he had been summoned. Not for his arrows, but for his essence. It shook him. He thought he knew his purpose, to serve his people, to honor Thranduil, to guard the forest. But in that moment, by that lake in Rhûn, Legolas began to understand that he was part of something much, much older. And the war they were preparing for, it wasn't just about a ring. The meeting didn't happen in a forest glade or an elvish hall. It wasn't under the protection of Galadriel's magic or in the shadows of Fangorn. It was in Rhûn, a place barely spoken of in the West. A land wrapped in mystery, suspicion, and silence. And the timing wasn't accidental. The Blue Wizards had waited for a lunar eclipse, a rare moment when the moon would be swallowed by shadow, leaving no light for the eye to see. Tolkien never fully mapped Rhûn, but in the history of Middle-earth he hinted at strange peoples and kingdoms far beyond Mordor's grasp, realms where Sauron's hand reached but didn't yet close. That's where the wizards had gone, and that's where they'd waited, hidden, working in secret. They knew the eye of Barad-dûr was relentless, but even it could be blinded for a moment, and that moment was now. Legolas arrived just as the eclipse began. The sky turned a deep bruised red, and the stars blinked in and out like nervous eyes. The lake where they met reflected nothing, not the sky, not the trees, just black glass. The air was still, too still. It was like the world itself had stopped breathing. That's when they stepped out from the mist, not old and bent like Saruman, not weary like Gandalf. LOTR and Pallando stood tall, wrapped in robes that shimmered like starlight, filtered through water. They spoke not with commands, but with questions. What do you hear in the silence, son of the wood? What does the sea say when it's calm? It wasn't a riddle. It was a test. The Blue Wizards had been surrounded by lies and half-truths in the East for so long. They needed to be sure this elf was who they hoped he was. Legolas answered without hesitation. The calm is never still. The silence is never empty. That was enough. In that moment, under the cover of a veiled moon, the Blue Wizards showed him their map. Not of roads or borders, but of movements, cults, symbols, whispers carried by birds, lines of influence that reached from Khand to the iron hills of Rhûn. They had been watching for centuries, sowing quiet resistance, but now something new was stirring, something deeper than armies. It wasn't just war. It was belief. That's why they had waited for the eclipse, not just for secrecy, but because the cult they feared had its own rituals tied to the moon's death. And they needed Legolas to witness it, to understand that the war for Middle-earth wasn't just about who held the ring. It was about who controlled the hearts of those beyond the West. What the Blue Wizards revealed next hit harder than any tale from Rivendell or report from Gondor's scouts. Deep in the lands of Rhûn, beneath the ruins of temples that predated even the founding of Númenor, a cult had survived, one that worshipped not Sauron, but his master, Melkor, Morgoth, the original darkness. While the West had been fighting orcs and Nazgûl, this cult had been quietly gathering strength in the shadows, untouched by the battles of the Third Age. This wasn't some group of scattered fanatics. They had leadership, doctrine, symbols, older than the White Tree, chanted in black speech and in twisted Quenya. They called themselves Aphadonia, the followers of the flame that fell. Their aim wasn't conquest, it was resurrection. They believed that fragments of Morgoth's essence had fallen to Middle-earth with him, pieces of his being bound in fire and stone, and they were trying to find them. The Blue Wizards had spent centuries sabotaging their rituals, corrupting their scrolls, diverting their prophets. But the cult had adapted. Recently, they'd begun using strange artifacts, unearthed from deep beneath the Red Mountains. artifacts humming with power unlike anything forged by men or dwarves. Some whispered it was iron laced with shadow, others claimed it bore the song of Melkor's original discord. Legolas listened carefully. He wasn't used to this kind of threat. In Mirkwood, danger was physical: spiders, orcs, corrupted beasts. But this was ideology. Faith turned into poison, a force that could infect not just people but entire cultures. He realized that if this cult succeeded in awakening even a whisper of Melkor, the war in the West would have been just a distraction. The real end would have come from the East. That's why they had called him. Not to fight, not yet, but to understand. To be a witness. Because once the fellowship was formed, once the ring-bearer set out, Legolas would need to know what truly hung in the balance. Destroying the ring would mean nothing if at the same time another darkness was rising in lands no one in Gondor even remembered. And here's the part most people miss. The Blue Wizards weren't just reacting, they had a plan, a dangerous one. But they needed Legolas to carry part of it back. In silence, without telling Gandalf, without alerting the council. Because if word got out that a cult of Morgoth was on the rise, panic would spread faster than orcs from Mount Gundabad. Legolas had seen wonders before. The light of Galadriel's mirror, the power of Elrond's voice. But what the Blue Wizard showed him was different. It wasn't like the magic of the West, full of ceremony and light. This was raw, old, the kind of magic that had roots in the music of the Ainur itself. And it wasn't something you cast, it was something you became part of. In a shallow cave carved by wind, near the shores of Rhune's inner sea, the wizards performed a rite. Not for show, but for memory. They called it Le Glaciel, the name of the breath. It was a lost form of elven sorcery, not Sindarin, not Quenya, but something older, something that came before the split of tongues, a language that didn't use words, but sound, rhythm, and intention. They told Legolas this knowledge had been buried. Most elves had forgotten it after the Sundering. The Noldor had their craft, the Sindar their songs. But this was wild. This was how the first elves called to the stars, how they sang to the trees before names were needed. The Blue Wizards had learned it not from elves, but from the echoes of it in the East, in tribes who remembered things the West had discarded. Legolas didn't just observe, he participated. At first it felt alien. There were no structured chants, no luminous glow, just breath, wind, silence, and pulse. But then something shifted. He felt the rhythm of the world around him respond, not as if he were commanding it, but as if he were being recognized. Like an old friend had finally turned around and said, "Ah, there you are." In that moment, he saw beyond sight. A flicker of futures, roads not yet walked. A forest burning under a sky of stars, a white tree weeping black tears, and a mountain splitting from within. It lasted a second, maybe less, but it stayed with him. And when it ended, the Blue Wizards didn't explain it. They just nodded as if to say, "Now you know what's really at stake." That kind of magic, it couldn't be taught. It could only be remembered. And Legolas, for all his skill with bow and blade, had just been handed something far more dangerous. Knowledge. Ancient, living knowledge. The kind that doesn't just change what you do, but who you are. This was the part that made Legolas hesitate, not from fear, but from doubt. Because what the Blue Wizards told him next went against everything he'd ever heard about the East. They hadn't just observed the Easterlings, they'd lived among them, disguised, hidden, but not distant. And more than that, they had taught them. Magic. Real magic. Not sorcery like Sauron's, but something gentler, older. These weren't armies or warlords they were training. They were healers, singers, wise women and outcasts. People forgotten or cast aside by the rising tide of Sauron's influence. In remote villages under starless skies, LOTR and Palando had lit small flames of resistance. Not with swords, but with knowledge, simple spells, songs that strengthened crops, charms to ward off nightmares. Not to win a war, but to keep hope alive. This was dangerous work. Not because the magic was unstable, but because it was forbidden. Sauron's spies moved like smoke in those regions, hunting down anyone who challenged the narrative and the cult of Melkor. They saw this as heresy. To teach light in the east was to commit sacrilege against the old shadow they were trying to revive. Legolas asked why. Why risk it? Why not bring those people west, or simply let them fall under Sauron's weight? Pallando answered quietly. Because if no one shows them the stars, they'll think the sky was always meant to be black. That line stuck with Legolas. It challenged everything the elves had practiced. Their habit of retreating, of preserving, instead of intervening. It also reframed the war. Maybe this wasn't just about destroying the ring. Maybe it was about deciding whether Middle-earth belonged to all its people, or just to those powerful enough to shape it. The Blue Wizards weren't building an army. They were building resilience, quiet networks, secret knowledge, things that could survive even if Sauron won, things that could one day rise again. Legolas didn't say much in response, but the next morning before leaving that village, he gave his cloak to a child who had learned to call down rain with her song. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a sign that he understood, that he would carry this knowledge back west, and that maybe, just maybe, the East still had a future worth fighting for. On the fourth night after the meeting with the Blue Wizards, Legolas was traveling alone, following the edge of a dying forest near the Sea of Rhûn. The air was dry, the soil cracked, and even the birds had fallen silent. But something drew him in. Not a sound or a scent, but a feeling like a memory that wasn't his. It led him to a grove unlike any he had ever seen. It was a ruin of trees, twisted, scorched, and broken. But in the center stood one trunk, still upright, still clinging to green. Vines curled around it in strange, deliberate shapes. It wasn't alive in the way most trees were, but it wasn't dead either. Legolas approached, and as he did, the wind stopped. Completely. Then came a voice, soft, mournful, and impossibly old. She didn't have a name, or at least not one he could pronounce, but the Blue Wizards would later confirm what he had suspected. This was the spirit of an Entwife, one of the ancient tree herders who had vanished long before the War of the Ring. Most believed they had been lost or destroyed, but this one had remained, trapped in the land, bound by grief and silence. Through broken elvish and gestures, she showed him visions, crops growing wild, fields shaped by care, not conquest. Then fire, chains, a great black hand closing around her home. She had watched as her sisters were burned, rooted out by men corrupted by Melkor's promise of dominion. But she had survived, not by running, but by turning inward, hiding her spirit deep within the land. Legolas knelt before her, not as a warrior, but as a listener. She brushed a vine across his cheek and left behind a mark, not a scar, but a symbol visible only under starlight. It burned cold and seemed to hum when he stepped near corrupted soil. A gift, or maybe a warning. Later, when he told the Blue Wizards, they exchanged glances. Yavanna's tears still fall where no one sees, LOTR murmured. The Entwives may not all be gone, they said, but they were not what they once were, and in lands touched by shadow, even the oldest beings could be twisted or awakened. After everything he saw, the secret resistance, the ancient magic, the half-buried sorrow of the Entwife, something inside Legolas shifted. His mission had been to gather, observe, and return. But when he turned back westward, with the pendant of the Blue Wizards hidden beneath his tunic and the memory of forgotten trees clinging to his senses, he didn't feel like the same elf who had left Mirkwood. Back home, things moved quickly. The Council of Elrond, the Fellowship, the long march through shadow and ice. But through it all, Moria, Lothlorien, Helm's Deep, the East, haunted him. Not like a threat, but like an unfinished thought. While everyone else spoke of Mount Doom, Legolas sometimes found himself staring across maps, wondering what lay beyond that blank stretch labeled simply Rhûn. When the war finally ended, and Aragorn was crowned, Legolas stayed in Gondor longer than any expected. Not out of duty, but out of curiosity. He wandered its shores. He listened to the gulls. But more than that, he listened to the rumors, sailors' tales, whispers from Harad, passing mentions of strange lights in the east, of lands healing where once there had only been iron. Gimli noticed. Of course he did. Dwarves might seem oblivious, but Gimli had fought beside Legolas long enough to recognize the difference in his friend's silence. One night in Ithilien, beside a small campfire, he asked outright, "You're not done yet, are you?" Legolas didn't answer right away. Then he just said, "There are songs I haven't heard yet, stories I need to see for myself." And so they went together, not westward toward the Undying Lands, but east, into Rhûn, into Khand, into places the White Tree hadn't touched in centuries. It wasn't a conquest, it was a conversation. Legolas didn't go to teach or judge. He went to listen, to reconnect with the land where he had once walked in secret, where he had learned that Middle-earth was far larger and far more complicated than any map in Rivendell could show. Some say the trip changed him more than the War of the Ring ever did. That by the time he finally did sail west, he carried with him not just the weight of battle, but the whispers of lands forgotten by time. And maybe, just maybe, a few seeds planted by wizards no one else remembered. During their meeting, as they reached its darkest point, the Blue Wizards took Legolas to a stone circle hidden deep beneath the earth, older than Numenor, untouched by war or time. There they revealed something they had been guarding for centuries. A prophecy, not written in Elvish or Western, but in an ancient form of Valoran, and another tongue that predated even the First Age. It spoke of a time after the fall of the Shadow, and time when the West would look inward, content, blind to the wound still festering in the East. But from those wounds, the text said, would rise a new strength, not of domination, but of understanding. A bridge forged not in war, but in shared memory, and the one to start that bridge. It would not be a Maya nor a king, but a traveler, a child of leaves and light. The Blue Wizards believed this traveler was Legolas. He didn't want the role. He wasn't a prophet or a guide, but they insisted because he had seen both worlds. He had walked in the deep woods of the West, and now in the burned valleys of the East. He had heard the laughter of Lothlorien and the weeping of the Red Hills. He could carry the memory of both and speak to each side without the weight of judgment. This prophecy wasn't a call to arms. It was a call to listen, to recognize that the peoples of Rhûn and Khand weren't just pawns of Sauron, but survivors of his influence, people with their own histories, some of which had once aligned with the light before being broken by conquest and fear. The Blue Wizards believed healing was possible. Not easy, but possible. They told Legolas that if he ever returned, he'd see signs. Songs sung in strange dialects that matched melodies of old Beleriand. Temples rebuilt with carvings of stars, not flames. Children wearing pendants shaped like leaves, not blades. These were the seeds of alliance, fragile, scattered, but growing, and they believed he would be the one to water them. Legolas didn't speak of this prophecy to Aragorn or Gandalf. Not at first. It felt too big, too soon. But in quiet moments, on watch or walking beside the Anduin, he would sometimes hum a melody no one else recognized. A song he'd learned not in the West, but in the deep places of the East, where hope was still learning how to speak. Before parting ways, the Blue Wizards gave Legolas something small. It wasn't a weapon, not a scroll or map. Just a pendant, a teardrop of crystal, faintly glowing, as if starlight had been caught and frozen inside. To most, it looked like nothing more than a polished gem. But the wizards told him it had been cut from a shard of light that fell from the skies above Valinor, before the darkening of the trees. They called it Elenarth, Star Remnant. It didn't grant power, and it didn't shine on command. But they said it would respond to true darkness, not shadows cast by fire, but the kind born of despair, betrayal, and forgotten truths, the kind of darkness Morgoth specialized in, the kind that lingers even after the armies have been defeated. Legolas didn't fully understand it at the time, but he wore it, hidden beneath his tunic, through every battle, from Amon Hen to Pelennor Fields. And though he never spoke of it, he often touched it in silence when the night felt too still. He said nothing of it to Frodo, to Aragorn, not even to Gimli. It wasn't a secret out of pride. It was protection. Some things are too heavy for words. There was one moment, though, right after the ring was destroyed, as they stood in the ruin of Mordor and the wind was still poisoned with ash, where Elenarth shimmered faintly against his chest. No one noticed, but Legolas did. It didn't glow because of Sauron's fall. It glowed because of what had been left behind, the emptiness that follows evil, the vacuum that waits to be filled. The Blue Wizards had warned him, if it ever burns bright, don't run. Listen, because the light wasn't just a warning. It was a key, a sign that somewhere, something old and buried was stirring again. And when it did, Legolas would know where to go, what to find, who to trust. He carried Elenarth with him when he sailed west. Some say he gave it to Galadriel before he crossed the sea. Others believe he dropped it into the ocean, letting it find its way back to the east. But a few, the ones who still tell tales by firelight, say it's still glowing somewhere in a hidden grove, waiting for the next traveler who dares to ask what lies beyond the edge of the map. There are so many corners of Tolkien's world we never got to explore, and this story, it's one of those threads that hints at something massive just beneath the surface. What if the war in the West was only half the story? What if the Blue Wizards weren't lost, but working in silence to make sure the light reached every corner of Middle-earth? If this story got you thinking, drop a comment below. What do you think happened to the Blue Wizards after the ring was destroyed? And do you believe Legolas really sailed west, or did he take one last journey east? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who's obsessed with Middle-earth lore like we are. And remember, not all forgotten stories are gone. Some are just waiting for the right person to tell them.